Hi, everyone. Welcome to this webinar sponsored by the ABA section of Civil Rights and Social Justice. We really appreciate your attendance here today to discuss, I think, what is a really important topic, and in particular has a nexus to a core pillar of the Biden administration's strategy to counter domestic terrorism, which, of course, is an issue that has been receiving a lot of attention, both in the policy debates and in the media. And so the topic of today's discussion is going to be a pillar of this strategy that is entitled, that has to do with what's called violence prevention. And basically, violence prevention initiatives, particularly in the context of counterterrorism policy and work, are intended to occupy the space prior to a person becoming, a potential subject of a criminal investigation. So earlier on, from when there are folks that are just kind of out there who might, as this program prescribes, display sort of signs that they might end up committing violence in the future. There are lots of folks in the advocacy space that have very serious concerns about these programs from multiple angles, as I think our panelists will represent, because a lot of these signs that are used and the risk factors that are posited by the Department of Homeland Security in particular as being indicative of violence are often overlap with adverse social conditions and socioeconomic conditions, mental health and psychiatric disabilities, and co-opt ideology in a way that historically has very much exclusively focused on particular communities and tarred them as especially susceptible to terrorism. So today we're going to discuss kind of the history of these violence prevention initiatives, ranging in particular from their real entrenchment in the federal government infrastructure under the Obama administration, under a program called Countering Violent Extremism, go through some of the empirical issues, the problems associated with why it's so difficult to try to predict when someone is going to turn violent, and also the harms that are associated with trying to do that. And then we'll overview some of the broader sort of policy landscape and legal considerations as our panelists bring their expertise from different areas on this issue. And with that, I'd like to briefly introduce our esteemed panelists who we're very appreciative to have here today. First, I'll start with Fatima Ahmad, who's the executive director of the Muslim Justice League, who has been very involved with the kind of on-the-ground efforts to oppose these programs in particular communities where they have been implemented, and very much is moving the fight forward as the policy landscape evolves. And then we have Jennifer Mathis, who is the Deputy Legal Director and Director for Policy and Legal Advocacy at the Bazelon Center for Mental Health Law. And Jennifer's been working on advocacy connected to folks with psychiatric disabilities and other challenges for some time now. And in particular, has had the chance to sort of observe how violence and predilection to violence and mental health have been increasingly linked, and some of the harms that are associated with that. And then we have Amelia Vance, who's the Director of Youth and Education Privacy at the Future of Privacy Forum. And Amelia has a ton of experience, in particular, a lot of great on-the-ground advocacy on connected to some of the instances that really highlight, the perils of trying to make assessments about when someone might pose a threat, and in particular, as connected to students and younger folks, especially. So, starting with Fatima, I'll let each of our panelists give a little bit of background about themselves and kind of their major concerns in this issue area.
Hi, thank you for having me, and thanks for setting this up, Harsha. So I am executive director at Muslim Justice League. We're based in Boston, and we are a small grassroots organization based in Massachusetts. But we, very much focus on all of the policing and surveillance that comes under, the national security complex. So predominantly, policies of the war on terror, but other types of policing and surveillance that are based on, people being seen as a national security threat. We were founded actually in response to the launch of Countering Violent Extremism, or CVE, in the US. And that was based on our, awareness of how CVE has impacted people in the UK, since they already had a model of this happening there. And so we very much have been, opposed to CVE, in Boston as a pilot city from the very beginning, about 5-6 years ago, maybe 7 years ago. It's hard to tell with COVID. And through that, knowledge of how it impacts people on the ground, and also, building up resistance to it here locally, we also started connecting with a lot of other organizations or grassroots folks across the country who wanted to understand, what is CVE, what is the issue here, how do we deal with it, particularly Muslim folks or folks from, Arab and South Asian communities or other communities targeted by CVE. And so we've been leading a, national network of folks for many years now around this, of, people who know already what it's like to be targeted by really overt surveillance and policing, and so can see quite clearly from CVE, what that will do to our, most vulnerable community members. So refugees, young folks, people with mental illnesses. So that has been like the crux of that work, and the Stop CVE network is currently engaged in a national campaign to end CVE nationally.
Great, thank you, Fatima. Jennifer?
Hi, so I have been at the Bazelon Center for Mental Health Law for about 22 years or so, and we do litigation as well as policy advocacy across the country. We were founded originally as the Mental Health Law Project. We will be 50 next year. And I would say that our intersection with countering violence extremism and other violence prevention efforts and programs is really that with almost everything that we do and what we work on is really advancing the rights of people with psychiatric disabilities in all aspects of life. Violence isn't part of that, but a false association of mental illness and violence really is a thread that runs through so much of our work. And for all of the time that I've been at the Bazelon Center, this is an issue that always threatens to undermine all that we are trying to accomplish in terms of ensuring that people have job opportunities, ensuring that people have housing opportunities, ensuring that people are integrated and accepted into their communities, and are not treated as pariahs and are not treated as folks of whom we should be scared. And certainly with the employment problems that people with psychiatric disabilities face, they have among the lowest employment rates of any group in the country, largely due to the pervasive stereotyping and stigmas and concerns with violence, fears about violence. It is particularly damaging that those stereotypes continue, and that there is a false narrative that pervades our public understanding. That was not always true. I have seen it change over all of the years that I've worked on this. It is recent, and there are actually a number of studies that have shown how recently public perceptions have dramatically changed, and reporting about mental health has significantly changed over the span of about 50 years or so. And whereas historically there was not this association, this automatic association with violence, in more recent years, that has really gelled, I think, because of some very deliberate efforts for a variety of different reasons, serving a variety of purposes for different constituencies, to advance that narrative. So there are folks who have deliberately advanced a narrative of mental health being linked to violence in order to gain attention to mental health services, and to sort of create some fear in order to, as a motivator to get funding, spending on mental health services. There have been other folks that have directed attention at mental health in order to deflect it away from gun violence prevention, gun control debates, anything regulating guns. And there have been other folks who found it, I think, a convenient thing to focus on, a convenient narrative to, quote unquote, do something about problems of violence, regardless of whether those efforts were targeting the right set of people. And I will talk more about the evidence later, but we are talking about people with mental illnesses being responsible for a pretty minuscule fraction of violence and gun violence, somewhere between 3 and 5%. So, the idea that people with psychiatric disabilities would be a primary focus of violence prevention efforts, whether in the CVE context or outside of that, has a lot of flaws and does a lot of damage that I will describe in more detail later. So in any event, we have seen this happen more and more in recent years. And I think that, we have started to at least get a lot more support from a lot of folks, including folks in a variety of different communities in education, because this set of issues has come up a lot in the context of schools, and targeting kids with psychiatric disabilities or emotional issues in schools, civil rights groups and mental health groups, disability rights groups. And so we have a coalition actually called Coalition for Smart Safety that has been working for a couple of years now to try to de-link and deconstruct this false association of mental health and violence. There is another coalition that Amelia and I co-chair, and she will talk about that, I think. But with that, I will end and turn it back to Harsha, or turn it over to Amelia.
Yeah, Amelia, please go ahead.
Thank you all so much for joining. I know in COVID world, being on yet another virtual meeting is painful. So really appreciate the fact that you all being here means this issue is important. I'm also going to apologize in advance because my cat wants to Zoom bomb today. So we're going to have some cattails showing up throughout. So I'm Amelia Vance. I'm the Director of Youth and Education Privacy for the Future of Privacy Forum. We are a nonprofit think tank focused on finding solutions to consumer privacy questions that lack clear legal or ethical answers. Specifically, my work at FPF is built around the idea that data and technology can enable invaluable advances in student success and learning, but also pose serious privacy risks. And so it is necessary to put guardrails around those uses of data and adoption of technology to make sure that student privacy and the related equity concerns are protected. We have I have been in this specific space of school safety, surveillance, and privacy, actually for slightly longer than I've been at FPF. I was previously at the National Association of State Boards of Education, where I wrote a report on school surveillance and the consequences for equity and privacy, explaining why schools are often monitoring students and talking about those privacy guardrails, but have been in the student privacy and child privacy space for about 8 years now, as we've seen an explosion of new student privacy requirements and restrictions in about 45 states just over the past 7 years, with 130 plus student privacy laws passing. So that is the other part of my job when I'm not working on surveillance and school safety. So over the past couple years in particular, and largely related to the coalition that Jennifer mentioned, and some new laws and actions taken in Florida, which I'm sure we'll dig into. We've spent a lot of time drilling in on how you create a balance and which tools to monitor students or to profile students are not only posing serious privacy and equity risks, but also not necessarily effective at all, are problematic because they don't work, because the risks dramatically outweigh the benefit, because there isn't independent research related to them. And in this area in particular, when we're talking about threat assessments, I'm afraid all of the above apply. And we're really in an area where there's a lot of technology that claims to be able to accurately say that, students may be a threat without a lot of evidence behind it. And that is not only according to the research that we've done and some of our friends on this webinar have done, but also according to studies funded by Department of Defense and others over the past few years on school safety. This is very new technology, untested, and with limited information about whether it works, let alone the consequences for the students on whom it is being used. We've put out a number of resources over the past few years. I'll drop some of them in chat, including not only blogs and resources on the legal issues here, but also general explanations such as an animated video on school safety and privacy, and rapid updates on timely issues, such as those related to the pandemic that were coming up as we reopened schools last fall. And the coalition that Jennifer mentioned, we co-chair a school safety coalition, which includes several education, disability rights, civil rights, and privacy organizations coming together to have conversations on the privacy issues related to school safety and student surveillance. That coalition wrote and put out school safety principles back in 2019, had 40 of the organizations sign on to those. Last year, we actually created related principles with 24 of the organizations on specifically privacy and equity related to the pandemic. And then we've also been involved in not only putting together op-eds, blogs, and providing resources to organizations related to some Florida legislation that came up a few years ago related to the aftermath of Parkland, which involves some social media monitoring of students and a big database that was built to be used for threat assessments. But also a more recent story out of Pasco County, Florida, about how law enforcement were getting access to student information and using that to profile them as potential future criminals. So lots been happening in this area, and really excited to have this conversation today.
Great. Thanks so much, Amelia. And I think before we proceed, just to provide a little bit of background for folks, on the sort of general paradigm that the core aspects of this, sort of violence prevention framework, how it operates. So the basic idea, like I said, is that, there are risk factors that make people more disposed to committing a violent crime, way before there's any sort of indication that they're actually engaged in criminal or violent activity. And then there's behaviors or indicators that suggest that they might be, about to act. So that the essential idea is to move law enforcement and other segments of society, including everyday citizens, closer to each other, so that folks can look out for these indicators and risk factors and make judgments about whether someone poses a threat. And Amelia mentioned the concept of threat assessment a couple of times, and that is one of the ways in which this decision-making process occurs. Basically, a threat assessment team is comprised of, law enforcement, teachers, counselors, potentially social service providers, and other folks. It can depend. But once a student is referred to this process, then all of these stakeholders kind of get together and apply these criteria to determine, whether the student poses a threat, whether it requires a criminal referral, whether it requires, some other sort of intervention. And there's a number of problems with this, but I think we'll get into that in the course of the discussion. But I just wanted to make sure that, folks understood sort of the space that this occupies. So even in the previous iteration, which I think I'll, turn to Fatima to discuss a little bit more, countering violent extremism, the history of, where the current Department of Homeland Security effort, which is now said to focus mainly on far-right violence. Where it comes from, though, is a very different place in sort of the years following September 11th. And Fatima, if you want to talk about countering violent extremism in particular and who it targeted and kind of some of the main problems with it. But also, I think one thing I really want to get at is one of the main claims of DHS is if these CVE programs, targeted Muslims and Arab communities in particular, and they're saying that we learned the lessons of the past and we're not going to do that anymore. Why are we still, concerned about it from the perspective of folks in those communities?
Yeah, thanks for that, Harsha, and thanks for that really great framing of what CVE as a framework, looks like. I love that framing of, bringing law enforcement and community folks closer together, right? Closing that gap. So when we look at CVE historically in the US, it was launched by the Obama administration. And it's really important to know that it actually tends to be a framework that progressive folks or folks supposedly on the left push for. It is seen as a soft alternative to other counterterrorism policies, but it's still a way to advance, counterterrorism policies. It's a way to expand policing by convincing community members to do the policing, right? You are training people on specific behaviors and indicators of violence that are, again, pre-criminal. They're not backed up. And really what is happening is you're just encouraging people to police other people in the community, right? And we already know what that looks like. So if you think about the slogan, see something, say something, who is it that's seen, right? And who gets reported when people are calling that, one of those hotlines from the Department of Justice or local law enforcement, right? It's folks on an airplane who look Muslim or speaking Arabic or perceived to be Muslim in some way. Who is it that a teacher is going to identify as potentially violent, right? It's a kid named Ahmed who built a clock and brought it to school. It's Black and brown young people in general. So we already know that any expansion of policing, any encouragement of policing, even beyond law enforcement, is just, again, exponentially increasing the racial and religious targeting that already happens from law enforcement. But now it's a way to get community members to engage in it, and particularly people who are providing social services, right? So what we've seen from CVE in the US, and this is true sort of globally, it is a global framework, but in the US in particular, there's a focus on refugees and low income folks. So people who need social services, right? Who might have to actually depend on community-based organizations or service organizations. It, impacts young people. Young people are already so heavily criminalized. And you can see from the early versions of CVE that youth and their parents were like one of the primary demographics that they were targeting. And then again, folks with psychiatric disabilities, folks seeking mental health care are another big target of this. But it's within this, racial and religious profiling, right? It's not this soft alternative to policing. You are either providing specific indicators that people can use to profile other people, or you're just very generally encouraging the folks that people should trust the most, right? It's not just anybody, right? They're going to, through education and mental health care, like those sectors and nonprofits, places that people assume that they can go and seek help are the places that are now being encouraged to actually police and profile, the people who really need that support. And so we know, regardless of what they call it, or how they try to sort of shapeshift CVE, it's still the same framing. It's still encouraging more community policing. It's still encouraging more racial and religious profiling. And it's also got this like very individual focus, right? I think it's important to know that like this is not a sound violence prevention strategy, right? We're not talking about addressing like root causes of violence, but rather putting a really big focus on identifying individuals before they become violent, which, of course, there are communities, Black and brown communities in particular, that have always been seen as inherently violent. And so this is always going to exacerbate that.
Yeah, that's thank you so much, Fatima. And as Fatima mentioned, one way I certainly our research at the Brennan Center certainly raises this concern of profiling, and basically that the breadth and vagueness of the various CVE indicators that are used essentially is a way that facilitates the channeling of societal biases. And one of the ways that I think about this in terms of an analogy, right, is, if you have a system that uses as a sign of violence something that millions of people, millions of Americans experience, then it gives a lot of discretion to the person who's being flagged to say who fits in that bucket and who doesn't. And we see this all the time, for example, with traffic stops or speeding, where certain groups of people, racial minorities, are pulled over or stopped on the streets way more often than white folks, and that is a product of bias. And in the same way, if you're using these kind of vague or broad criteria in this context, too, there's no reason to think that that wouldn't apply. The biases that bear on whether how threatening a person is perceived to be, for example. And so thanks for that. And Jennifer, moving to you, I would be interested to know kind of how this discussion has played out in the context of, folks with, mental health or psychiatric disabilities, and in particular, the state of the sort of empirical literature on this. So, there are multiple reasons. The department, for example, provides a lot of studies that they say validate these indicators, but I think it'd be useful to kind of view it through the prism of, one particular topic area or discussion.
Sure. So that's a great question. And actually, I think the evidence is pretty consistent in most of the studies that have been done. The one point I mentioned earlier is the people with psychiatric disabilities account for such a tiny fraction of both violent episodes and gun violence. 95 to 97% of violence is committed by folks who don't have a psychiatric disability. The evidence also shows people with psychiatric disabilities are much more likely to be the victims of violence than the perpetrators of violence. And the evidence shows that having a mental health diagnosis or history or receipt of mental health treatment is not a useful predictor of violence. Most of the studies show we can't predict violence very well at all, to the extent that there are other factors that correlate with violence. Mental illness is not actually up there as a significant one. There's a much higher correlation, for example, of being young and male. And nobody is suggesting that we make young men a primary target of violence prevention efforts. But yet, we've focused on mental health in that type of way. As I mentioned before, certainly the discourse has shifted pretty significantly over time, and there are some interesting studies. There was one a few years ago that looked at 1995 to 2014, and in those 2 decades, there was a significant shift. I think there are other studies that show there's been a significant shift all along since 1950 through the 1990s. But if you just look at these 2 decades, the news stories in the first decade of these two were significantly less likely. They looked at a lot of studies all on mental illness and, or rather news stories on mental illness, and the ones in the second decade, the 2005, 2006 to 2014, much more likely to talk about violence in the context of mental health. And overall, with the whole study, it's really, I thought it was fairly remarkable. The most frequently mentioned topic overall in this study of all these articles that talked about mental illness was violence. 55% of stories about mental illness talked about violence. In comparison, 14% talked about successful treatment or recovery from mental illness. So
That's crazy.
You can see where these public perceptions are coming from. Certainly very divorced from what the evidence actually is. I will say that at the same time as all of this is happening, I think there has been some interesting education among folks in certain communities. The gun violence prevention community, for example, I think has started to recognize this. And there was a time when folks in that community were talking about people with psychiatric disabilities as ticking time bombs waiting to explode. And, there was a lot of kind of fear mongering and inaccurate sort of conveyance of the information, the data and truth, and a lot of stereotyping. And I think that now there has been a lot more recognition in that community that it doesn't serve their interests to focus on a group of folks who are not primarily responsible for violence and are not likely to, if those efforts are not likely to bear fruit if you're sort of focused in the wrong direction. And so I think that is the one, I guess I would say, positive trend I've seen in recent years is that certainly the folks who focus on gun violence, as opposed to, sort of countering violent extremism as a kind of community, but the folks who are specifically focused on just, gun violence prevention, I think have really shifted in a helpful way in the last few years.
Great. Thanks so much, Jennifer. And that's a really interesting statistic about how often the term violence shows up in studies connected to mental illness. And I just, on the empirical point, you can kind of go through various studies and highlight problems with them. They're retrospective, focus on a few dozen folks, employ really broad criteria that facilitates that subjectivity. But I think in concept, I would really underscore here is that it is simply statistically impossible to predict when someone is going to commit a mass casualty attack because it is a rare event. And so, and the government studies that support these violence prevention programs, they recognize this. In fact, the Rand Corporation's 2019 study about terrorism prevention in the United States said, prediction is not a feasible thing. Same thing for the National Institutes of Justice study that synthesized a number of research on the topic. And, then you have to question, nonetheless, why is this framework, why does it persist? If the response from policymakers is often, even if we can't predict, we can still try to prevent or reduce the chance. But after kind of kicking the tires on it, I think probably shared by panelists is that, that's not really very much of a supportable view. So that I would like to turn to Amelia and ask kind of, so what happens when you try to figure out who is a student that might go commit violence? You can talk about some of the tools, but maybe draw in some of the concrete stories that you have on this topic, and would love to hear more about that.
Absolutely. So I think it's important to note that, schools have always watched students. It's part of what we expect of them. They're standing in loco parentis in many cases, and parents want to make sure that their kids aren't being cyberbullied, accessing inappropriate content, are kept safe. But it's gotten a lot trickier over the past few years as technological solutions have been shopped to schools, to parents and others. And the level of monitoring that is now occurring is something that I think most parents are certainly not aware of. Most schools may not be thinking deeply about, and it may in fact be harming the likelihood that students seek help, that there, may be a chilling effect, a reluctance to be wrong, to step outside the box as you're learning. All sorts of issues that can come up from extensive monitoring. So some of what we've seen from schools is an outgrowth of what is required under the Children's Internet Protection Act, CIPA, which required all entities that receive E-rate funds, which covers about 95% of schools, to filter their networks and, oh, by the way, also monitor them. And it doesn't really describe what that means. And of course, when that law passed in the late 90s, early 2000s, that meant the teachers looking around in the computer lab to make sure kids were not on irrelevant sites. But schools aren't entirely sure exactly what they're supposed to do. The E-rate funds are essential. And so you've had more and more adoption of the filtering technology and often the outgrowth of those companies into this monitoring space, as well as some new companies that say that they can predict self-harm or threats based on scanning all the same content that's being scanned for filtering. This could take place on a school device, which I think is slightly more expected. It could take place on a personal device if a student signs in to their account. It could take place on a cell phone that's connected to the school's network or other device that's connected to the school's network. And essentially what sort of carries across most of these products is a passive scanning that's looking at pretty much everything, the websites visited, the documents that are saved to the school's cloud, pictures, chat records, pretty much everything a child does online at school or when signed into accounts at home. And depending on the product used by schools, that may be feeding into a profile of a student that could be pulled up at any time of the different websites they're visiting and types of content they're accessing. Or it could be a more privacy protective version, which is often just passive scanning of everything in order to accomplish that filtering goal, but not actually keeping any of that information unless there is a hit, unless there is, an inappropriate word flagged or other issue that indicates self-harm or a threat. But as we're talking about now, whether technology can do that right now is we're pretty sure the answer is no. And so while there's a lot of discussion about flagging certain words, especially around threats, there's very little evidence that is actually possible. And administrators are much more likely to be overwhelmed with false flags and information that turns out to not in fact be a threat and may instead be used to stigmatize a student to cause their suspension or other issues. You also have major equity issues because certain students are more dependent on school devices, especially with the pandemic. That may have been their only way of interacting with their friends, their family. And so the fact that these devices are often monitored means that those students are going to be watched, have a record created of that activity, while students whose parents can afford to have their own device or to not share devices won't be monitored unless they're signed into that school account. So it's a technological infrastructure that's set up around the country. There are many more sort of more hands-off districts. Some just rely on reporting from students and blocking certain websites to accomplish their filtering and monitoring obligations, but you really have a broad range of how detailed the monitoring is. But as I mentioned, it's often a lot more invasive and a lot more than most parents or students are aware.
Great, thank you, Amelia. And, I actually would like to discuss one particular example connected to the Pasco County in Florida. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about that, because I think it's a instance or story that really highlights well some of the harms that can come with, these sort of predictive efforts to determine who might become violent or become a criminal in the future.
Yeah, it's a story that you wouldn't think would exist outside of maybe a short story fiction collection. You had law enforcement in Pasco County running a predictive policing program on everyone. The Tampa Bay Times did an incredible job doing some investigative journalism to shine light on this. And as part of their report on predictive policing in general happening, they also found that there was some data coming from schools to law enforcement, and that there was a list of students who were essentially labeled as future criminals that law enforcement was proactively going to houses, watching them in school, taking notes on their behavior, and very few people knew it was happening. Certainly the parents and students had no idea it was happening. Many teachers, school counselors, and others in the school system had no idea it was happening or only knew at the highest level what was going on. It's been unclear in the follow-up to that story. It came out, I think, last October, November, exactly what data was being sent from the school to the law enforcement to the sheriff's office. But from a statement the sheriff gave, we actually pulled together a blog saying that this was illegal sharing. It actually violates federal law. The Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, FERPA, does not allow information to be shared with law enforcement in bulk in the way that it was being shared in this case. You had the full 20,000 students in the district who were labeled by the school early warning system as at risk or off track being sent to the sheriff's office. And the sheriff's office was then comparing that list to a list of students that had been flagged by social services or who had had interactions with law enforcement in the past. You can't turn over 20,000 students' names to law enforcement under FERPA, so you're already talking about an illegal data sharing there, let alone whatever other data that law enforcement may have been accessing or may have received from the district as part of this program. There's been a large outcry. Very happy to be part of a coalition led by Southern Poverty Law Center and NAACP LDF that has been working to both get things changed in Pasco and shine light on where this may be happening in other areas of the country. But we know that there are some students who were on this list, there were, I believe, 420 students in the district who were on the list. And those students constantly had law enforcement coming into their lives in a way that, as we know, can be extremely harmful, can further the likelihood of future interactions with the criminal justice system, and certainly forecloses certain opportunities that those students would ideally have as they're growing up. So very, very problematic situation. And I think the thing that I worry about most is the only reason we know about this is because of multi-month reporting by the Tampa Bay Times. And so it's unclear what similar programs may exist, because the predictive policing manual that the sheriff's office had is, I think, widely used, widely cited across the country. And we don't know what other systems exist here and maybe targeting kids.
Yeah, thanks so much, Amelia. I think that's a really interesting point, especially the point about kind of the outcome that is being searched for becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy. Simply, regardless, because a lot of times when folks are advocating for these kinds of initiatives, what they will say is, well, what's the harm, right? Like, we're just kind of looking to see if people might turn violent. In many cases, these factors or indicators or criteria might not actually reveal anything about violence. And if that way, we'll just, get them access to a social services provider, counselor, whatever they might need. So what's the harm? And I think as Amelia underscored very well, there are really serious, stigmatic harms, and then also harms associated with just bringing innocuous activity to the attention of the cops that ends up from a person just being out there to potentially having a criminal record for no good reason at all. So I want to ask Fatima a particular dimension of this, and it dovetails with one of the questions that is asked in the question and answer box. And the question is, what role does disinformation and propaganda play in causing domestic terrorism, and what are we doing about it? But I think it kind of dovetails with this concept of radicalization. So basically that the process by which a person goes on to commit ideologically motivated violence is that they, are out in society, they, potentially get exposed to messaging or ideas that they find appealing, perhaps because they're feeling isolated and disconnected from their community. And that ends up becoming their worldview and the precursor to committing a act of violence. And so, Fatima, if you want to talk a little bit about, what's the problem with this kind of view and paradigm, and what have been some of the harms that have emerged from adopting it in the past?
Yeah, so the first thing to understand is where this radicalization theory comes from, right? Where did this start? Because as Harsha mentioned earlier, even the people who are the institutions who are promoting CDE and this framing will have disclaimers and plenty of places where they say, there is no way to actually predict who is committing violence. So why, what is this actually based on? So this radicalization theory, to my understanding, came about in, around 2010, 2011, from places like the NYPD, so the New York Police Department, and other institutions, I think both in Europe and the US, who wanted to understand, supposedly wanted to understand, why they allegedly had, Muslims in their community supporting organizations abroad or supporting violence abroad, or allegedly, mobilizing and moving abroad to commit violence. And so, that is really essential to know that this theory did not come from a long, broad study of, people committing violence. It didn't come from like a really robust understanding of how people become politically motivated, aside from, committing violence, right? Really, it was looking at a very specific subset of people and kind of working backwards. And so that is really obvious in the early iterations of CDE, because the indicators that they're putting out there are just clearly Muslim behaviors, right? Wearing the hijab, growing a beard, going to certain countries, which again shows that this was not like a robust study, given that those indicators apply to so many people who are not committing violence or doing anything except being Muslim, or being assumed to be Muslim. And so that's where that theory comes from. But unfortunately, it's just caught on. Like, people talk about people get radicalizing to violence, and these sort of keywords, so radicalization, extremism, and terrorism are used almost interchangeably without clear definitions of what we're actually talking about. They're really not specific. They are so vague and facially neutral that it makes it seem like, this is a theory that applies to everybody. But we know that those keywords like trigger, right, a certain understanding of like who we're talking about. Right. And so what you see now is people saying domestic terrorism, essentially to mean not foreign terrorism, right? Foreign terrorism being Muslims, domestic terrorism being white supremacist violence. That seems to be like the common way that people are using that terminology, again, without like deconstructing what do these terms actually mean, right? What are we really talking about? And again, noting those disclaimers that having certain politics does not mean you will commit an act of violence. Having any or all of the indicators that are in any of the CDE literature does not mean that you will commit an act of violence. That is like almost a direct quote from like CDE proponents. And so, yeah, I think people are hung up on this idea of how do we understand, how individual people are mobilizing or becoming violent when we do have some broad answers about what causes violence. So to the question of like disinformation and like the rise of domestic terrorism, I would say rather than thinking about disinformation and the internet and QAnon and all of these things, go back in history, right? Why were white people lynching Black people in this country? Like, why did that happen, right? Why did, I think the 372nd Military Company torture people at Abu Ghraib in Iraq when we were at war? Like, how is that connected to the larger system of white supremacy, right? Rather than thinking about who individually is going to commit that act of violence, which I understand like why, we're motivated to do that, why we want to prevent individual people from doing that, but why not actually look at the root causes of it? So where is that disinformation coming from? Or where is that mobilization coming from? Who are the elected officials and government agencies that have promoted, white supremacy and racist understandings and Islamophobic policies that actually promote that kind of violence? So that is what I'm thinking about.
Yeah, that's thanks so much for that, Fatima. I think the history is really, really important. Often, the folks that have really been challenging established strictures of state power are the ones that end up being called radical or going against the grain, right? And we saw that going back to the civil rights movement and even before that, of how activists, have been treated by the national security state. And that history, I think, always provides interesting context. And one more point that I would make on that is a lot of the impetus for some of these violence prevention initiatives and counter-radicalization initiatives comes from the events of January 6th. And obviously there were folks with a bunch of different kind of ideological dispositions, variations of them that rioted into the Capitol building. But when we're talking about trying to put a hammer down on, potentially views that might be dangerous or corrosive to democracy, I think it's always important to remember the fact that a major actor in encouraging the riot was the President of the United States. With significant support from a major political party in the United States. So the notion that we're going to try to root out, I think, in my view at least, disinformation or propaganda by trying to flag dangerous content and without commenting on the appropriate parameters of that, it's still, I think that some of the things that we find problematic very much exist in the structures of power. So always something to keep in mind when you're trying to empower a state agency to carry out that mission. Jennifer, I also want to bring you in on a slightly different dimension of the issue. Given your work on this connection for a period of time, have you encountered particular stories or kind of cases or folks that have been affected by this kind of framing, and what is that? If you could tell us a little bit to the extent that you can, and what does that kind of say about the broader story here?
Sure, absolutely. I think that there are so many of the clients that we have represented who have struggled with adverse consequences of public perception about them, about their disabilities, and what that says about them, and the fear that they are dangerous. It comes up in employment all the time. It comes up in schools. I will give an example. There's one I think that is particularly powerful that was not actually a client of ours, but it's a kid who was in high school with autism, who was subjected to a threat assessment process in Oregon. And there's some news stories written about him. And he essentially was eventually driven out of school. He came under the scrutiny of this threat assessment team. And I would just note that the assignment of threat assessment teams very often is to kids with disabilities, kids particularly with psychiatric disabilities or autism. In fact, one of the recommendations of the Florida School Safety Commission was to assign a threat assessment team to any child who had an IEP that had was related to behavior issues. And so this kid essentially was targeted and harassed and, was monitored constantly. Everything that he did was questioned. He brought a blunt scissors to school and was accused of sharpening it slightly. He was accused of doing all sorts of things. He fit a certain profile. He had a trench coat and, he didn't behave in, I guess, the most socially conforming ways just because of his disability, and that he interacted differently, and he was a bit of a loner, and he was quiet, and people assumed all of these things about him, and they nicknamed him Shooter. Guy had never done anything violent, anything dangerous, had never threatened anybody, but because of those perceptions about him, because he looked different, because he acted a little different, he was targeted in this way. And his parents spent a long time trying to work with the school, trying to understand, what is it that you think he did? Why do you think he's a threat? And eventually, after a prolonged battle, and I think with parents who were invested in working with the school and trying to collaborate and trying to kind of get to a good resolution, finally threw their hands up, and the kid couldn't stay in school anymore because it was ruining his mental health, his life. And so they pulled him out of school. And that shouldn't happen. I know many other folks who are representing kids who have been pulled out of school for significant periods of time when threat assessment teams are investigating. And typically these are kids with autism or other developmental disabilities, sometimes emotional disturbance, who have not done anything in particular that is dangerous or concerning, but have behaved differently. And as a result of this focus, this kind of mission of focusing on identifying the next school shooter, and of seeing everything through the lens of safety and threats in schools, really, it has been extremely concerning that you've got all these kids missing classroom time and not learning for no really good reason other than that they had a disability that triggered somebody's radar, that they seemed different. And so I think that is how I see it playing out. That, and certainly in general, there's so many that it's hard to think of sort of all the individual facts of one story, but over and over again, certainly I have seen it where violence comes up, fears about violence, fears about dangerousness come up for the people that we represent, and they're often not allowed to live in the community. I represent a lot of people who are institutionalized, and our goals under civil rights class action lawsuits are to enforce their civil rights, to have community integration, to live in the most integrated setting and receive services. And you can see over and over again the kinds of things that are said, the presumptions that people are dangerous, really not based on, specific behaviors, but based on conjecture that this type of disability is going to make you a dangerous person.
I want to jump in quick and just add a couple things to the great information Jennifer just provided. I posted the link to the article she mentioned in chat. Highly recommend that everyone read it. It is incredibly well written and moving, and understandable that there was a threat investigation in this case, but the fact that it lasted, I think, for a year and a half, well past when police had said this is not a dangerous kid, ended up not providing the parents with any information about what had started the threat assessment inquiry, which was, a librarian overhearing another kid calling this person shooter, and not actually asking that kid about what the context was. And that child was searched every single day when they came into school, sometimes multiple times a day, had to check in as they were going through this threat assessment process. It was really unbearable, unsustainable, and something where you had the parents fully cooperating and trying to resolve this as the process went on. But it really did end up in the child basically ending up dropping out. I think, again, this is something where I worry about the stories that aren't being told. I gave a talk on school safety and privacy in a state a couple of years ago and told the story from this article, and had someone come up to me afterwards and mention how close to home it was for them, because they're like, if I didn't work for the school system, this would have been my child. There was an investigation launched, and but for the fact that I was in the system and they trusted me, this would have happened. We're dealing with a process that is unfortunately broken, and often, as has already been mentioned, is probably ineffective on its face. And you end up with students being stigmatized, students who do need help, being stigmatized as a threat in these cases. And I have to mention, and maybe toss it back to Jennifer, that the stigmatization is real. I know there was a case, Jennifer, that Bazelon took about a student whose friend had, I believe, committed suicide. That student checked themselves in to a hospital because they were having suicidal thoughts, and they were not allowed back on campus. But Jennifer, did I get any of that wrong?
No, this is another context in which this comes up, is not just sort of elementary and secondary school, but colleges and universities. I think we see this routinely, this sense, and a lot of it comes from actually monitoring of what these kids are saying and doing on platforms, etc. But yes, with this case, this kid had his best friend commit suicide, and so he went voluntarily to seek help because he started to think, I've never thought about suicide before, but I'm thinking about it now, and I just want to get help. And while he was in the university's hospital, the next day was served with a notice that he'd violated the disciplinary code for endangering himself and would not be allowed on campus, would not be allowed to be in classes, would not even be allowed to get his belongings to leave. He had to wait in a police car on the campus while his parents went in and retrieved his belongings from his dorm room. And so, it is, again, it's something that we see in so many different contexts. And certainly, with higher education, what happens is there is this sense that, people are very interested in, what the mental health of their students is, not so much so that they can provide help, but so that the result is not, we want to support you. The result is, go kill yourself someplace else. We don't want to be responsible. I mean, it's maybe not the most charitable way to describe it, but that is essentially, I think, not far from what it amounts to when these students are routinely forced to take mandatory leaves that are extensive and that are far beyond, their own treating professionals say is appropriate or necessary. In most cases, the treating professional is saying, actually, the person is fine. And fine to be here. And in fact, it would be more harmful to actually, kick her out of school. But that is so frequently what happens.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think the Oregon case in particular is a really interesting example because it illustrates well what the harms of a threat assessment can be. In other words, right, the kid, fit what some people view as a stereotype of a school shooter with the trench coat and, potential disability and, esoteric interests, etc. And the problem is that when you have these criteria, right, like these concerning behavior criterion, social isolation as a criterion, what it ends up doing is that it validates that sort of stereotyping because almost anyone can fit into it. And I think that's a really, honestly, serious harm of these kinds of initiatives.
I think it's even more exacerbated, sorry to jump in, when we're talking about teenagers. We're talking about moody kids who are probably playing violent video games and have mood swings and, various other things. I know the Secret Service National Threat Assessment Center said there's no single profile of an attacker, but pay close attention to students that exhibit concerning behaviors such as dramatic changes in mood or behavior, depression, and increased conflict with peers. I don't know a teenager who doesn't fit in that bucket. And the fact that this is so overbroad is not only problematic from an efficacy perspective, but also means that perhaps we have a lot of school personnel spending a lot of time that could be better spent helping kids focused on so hard on identifying, behaviors that may not indicate anything.
Yeah, thanks. And I figure it makes sense to just jump into the Q&A. There's a couple of questions out here. And I think Amelia is probably I'll answer the first discrete one. Is access to a weapon a factor in threat assessment? Yeah, it is. And, I would just note about that factor, while obviously, at least in most cases, it's a necessary condition in order to, commit mass violence, it's still not going to be a very specific factor. There are lots of people that live in households where there are guns and, millions. So while, it is a factor, it's just never going to be as predictive as we might think. But yes, it is a factor in threat assessments. And so the other question is how much monitoring of students is appropriate. And the person points out in at least one instance, a student was Googling how to hang himself and his suicide was prevented in real time by the school contacting the parent. Obviously, that's an example that, could be presented as a benefit of doing this kind of monitoring. So I'm curious if Amelia or any of our panelists have thoughts on that.
I think it's really important to differentiate between an obvious searching how to tie a noose, searching, for other things that we know, 90% certainty we know are indicators of self-harm. There's a big difference between that and creating generalized profiles that may or may not indicate anything, but have to be sifted through by school employees or by, outside contractors paid by the school with school funding that, include things like, did you Google the word depression, which might be part of a school assignment? Did you mention something in your college essay about, bullying in your past? Well, that's flagged too. In one case, there was a great article released in the 74 this morning that talks about, yes, there are some anecdotes of students who are actively, where they actively were able to identify and get those students help. But often we're talking about the egregious cases there, and it's a pretty small percentage. And so how can we make sure that we are balancing the potential privacy risks, certainly seeking where we can to identify where there are obvious harms and get help to students? But I worry about the student who doesn't look up the National Suicide Hotline because they know they're being monitored. I worry about the student who doesn't end up Googling, how do you know if you're gay and can't find a community when we know that population is disproportionately likely to commit self-harm, especially if they don't have a community around them. I worry that we're focused on identifying kids and not actually getting them help. It's hard. And, as someone who has a family member who committed suicide, it is especially personal to me. And I understand exactly why people want to do this. I want to make sure we're doing things that actually work. And we're not in a place where we're actually talking about things that definitely work.
Okay, thanks so much for that, Amelia. I don't know if folks have other questions, but otherwise, if any of our panelists, I know Fatima, you haven't hopped in a little bit. So anything else you'd like to add about where, how we're looking at this moving forward, in particular, connected to your, grassroots advocacy and organizing, would love to hear about that.
Yeah, first want to say I'm so grateful for everything that Jennifer and Amelia shared today. I think one of the big issues is that everyone wants to do something about violence, and people are not carefully and thoughtfully constructing, like Amelia said, things that actually work and things that support people, right? There's a way in which you do this that further criminalizes people, further stigmatizes people versus pulling people in, right? Making sure that people have the support that they need and the community that they need to navigate these issues. So I think that is, the response to folks who say, well, what do you want to do about violence, right? Like, what are we actually going to do? There are other ways to do it. And if you are serious about that, then take it seriously, right? Make sure that these theories and programs that are being set up are, thoroughly vetted and understood and supported by people who are impacted. And I think when it comes to our, advocacy, the thing to know right now is that, like I mentioned earlier, I think it's often progressive folks who actually push for these types of policies or these programs. And so unfortunately, we've seen with the Biden administration, further expansion of this work. So, speaking of like threat assessment teams, I think within the FBI or the Department of Justice, there's a program called DEEP, which is all about, funding law enforcement collaboration with healthcare workers. We in Boston have a local threat assessment team that is, based out of the Refugee Trauma Center at the Boston Children's Hospital and is working with the FBI. And people don't know that. They don't know that it exists. And they don't know that, the current administration is like supporting and funding more and more of this under different names, even though communities have called for an end to it from the beginning. We never said, use CVE against white people to combat white supremacy. We always said CVE is white supremacy, CVE is policing, and we want it to end. And so that's where our advocacy is at right now, is trying to get folks to understand how this will actually further harm, so many marginalized communities, including the communities targeted by white supremacy, that it's not a solution to domestic terrorism, domestic violent extremism, however you want to call it, white supremacy, white supremacist violence. It's not a solution to that. It's an expansion of that. And so that's really what we're focusing on right now. And we're focusing on, how do we build up a legislative push to end this when it is like proliferating too. You have programs within the Department of Homeland Security, you have programs within the Department of Justice, you have local law enforcement doing this, and nonprofits that have, sprung up because of that, that support and funding. So we're really looking at, what are all the programs, like threat assessment teams, like traditional CVE grants, community awareness briefings on indicators, like what is all of that exists, and how do we build a coalition and movement to end, that framework.
Thanks so much, Francois. Look forward to working with you, of course, moving forward on this. And I suppose if there's just anything else, Jennifer or Amelia want to add to close out, I think we can go ahead and do that.
This is Jennifer. I guess I would just say very briefly, I think we have to be careful with this whole suicide issue. I do think suicide is different, and sometimes people talk about how suicide is a good reason, is a justification for why we should do a lot of things that people agree we maybe shouldn't do when we're thinking about other types of violence, but that, oh, if we can get the people who are going to harm themselves, then it's worth it. And I think there are a lot of complications about how to address suicide, and certainly, as somebody mentioned, like many people that actually will not call the suicide hotlines because of what has happened to them in the past, because suddenly unbeknownst to them, law enforcement shows up, or they hang up the phone and they think that they have moved on, and then there's somebody carting them away from their workplace, and so a lot of our suicide policy and approaches have been kind of running to get somebody before the train, and trying to run in front of the train and save the person. And, as I once heard somebody describe it very well, real suicide prevention is really walking with somebody alongside the train all the way. And, talking to understanding the root causes of the problem, and you're not going to solve it. You may have prevented somebody's suicide at a particular moment in time, but that's not effective suicide policy. Suicide policy really entails sort of taking the time and pain to understand what is happening that is causing that person's distress, and trying to deal with it, which is hard, complicated, long. And, you can do monitoring to, catch somebody here and there, but I wouldn't say that's an effective substitute for real suicide prevention.
Thanks so much, Jennifer. Amelia, did you have anything else to close out?
I think the only thing I have is, one of the most important things here is not even necessarily pointing out many of the things we've pointed out over this webinar, but the fact that this conversation is not being had when these systems are adopted. There's an assumption that the technology is so much more advanced and we need this, and this will help us, this will help kids, this will prevent violence. And if we're not even having those conversations, if the question of whether something even works doesn't come up, if there isn't transparency to parents, to kids, that this is even occurring, we end up with a system where we break the trust between schools and communities. We endanger really valuable data-driven school initiatives. The system I mentioned was happening in Pasco, the early warning system, is a pretty good initiative. It flags students early for school personnel, for their teacher to say, this student may not graduate, so you don't have students dropping out of high school. You instead can have interventions much earlier. That isn't information that should ever go to law enforcement. That's information that needs to stay between the child, the teacher, the parent, to help them. And if we use data that is being collected to help students, technology that is brought on to help students to instead stigmatize and harm them, that means that we're not going to be able to help kids, that these systems will not be trusted, will fall down under the weight of public opinion when they are abused. And we can't take advantage of the technology and the data use that really can identify and provide assistance to kids. This isn't a monitor kids or, don't monitor them at all conversation. This is a, how do we do this with the necessary guardrails, considering all of these equities, and have a conversation about what works in a community.
Thanks so much, Amelia. And thank you so much to all of our esteemed panelists, Fatima, Jennifer, Amelia, for bringing, I think, interesting angle based on their own professional backgrounds and experiences that are connected to this broader issue of violence prevention. So we really, really appreciate your time. Thanks so much. And thanks to the ABA and Ali Kielskard for organizing the panel. Your support was really helpful, Ali. And of course, to everyone for tuning in and taking an hour and a half out of their day to listen more about what I think is a really important issue, and I think a framework that is significantly being bolstered and expanded within federal and state and local policy. But with that, hope everyone has a great rest of the day and take care, folks.